Some of this work killed a man in under a second. Most of it took 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and he showed up for it every single morning anyway, because the pay was good and nobody had told him yet what the job was doing to his lungs, his jaw, his blood. This is a countdown of the 100 deadliest jobs of the industrial age. 100 trades, ranked one way and one way only. By the odds that doing this work for a living was the thing that eventually killed you. The goriest death on record doesn't move the needle here. Neither does the single worst accident anyone ever wrote up in a newspaper. Only the odds do. That one rule changes everything about this list. It means a boy dipping matchsticks in a back room in London can outrank a man riveting a bridge 400 feet over a river. It means the quiet killers, the ones that took years, that never made a headline, that just wore a body down one shift at a time, beat almost every explosion on record. A dropped rivet is a story. A man's jaw dissolving over 18 months of ordinary shifts almost never made the papers at all. And that's exactly why it belongs at the top of a list built on odds instead of headlines. Hold on to that rule, because by the time we reach the bottom of this list, you'll understand why the single deadliest job in industrial history didn't kill with an explosion, a fall, or a machine at all. It killed with something else, and it did it in under 2 years. We're keeping this to one window, 1780 to 1940. Steam power to the edge of modern safety law. The stretch when a machine could outproduce 100 men, and the men who fed it were, mostly, disposable by design. No plague doctors, no powder monkeys on a wooden warship. This is industrial death, not medieval death. The kind of dying that only became possible once a factory, a mine company, or a railroad decided a man's body was worth less than the machine he served. And here's a thread you'll hear again before this list is over. Almost every fix already existed. Somebody had already built the safer coupler, the safer paint, the safer drill. It just cost money nobody wanted to spend. Hold on to that too. Number 100. Table knife grinders in Sheffield. Lighter work than their cousins further down this list, but even the softer wheels sprayed enough steel and stone grit into the air of a room no bigger than a kitchen to scar a man's lungs by 40. The trade had a name for the cough. It never made it onto a death certificate. 99. Slate quarrymen in North Wales, splitting rock faces thin enough to roof half of Britain, in weather that never stopped for rain, wind, or the kind of cold that settled into a man's joints for good. Silicosis took the ones the rockfalls missed. 98. Rock salt miners of Cheshire, working tunnels 200 feet down, held up by nothing but the salt itself, by candlelight, where a guttering flame was often the last warning a man got before a wall came down and buried him where he stood. 97. Lime kiln stokers, feeding a fire that burned near 2,000 degrees, their eyes burning red by the end of most shifts, breathing the caustic dust the kiln threw back at them long after they'd gone home for the night. Men who worked the kilns into middle age were dying of scarred lungs that looked, on autopsy, like something out of a much older man. 96. Child laborers in the brickfields, 10 years old, barefoot, hauling wet clay loads heavier than their own bodies, across ground baked hard enough to blister skin, their lungs filling with the same fine dust that killed grown men twice their size, and did, in some of these children, before they'd lived long enough to become one. 95. Tannery limers, soaking hides in caustic pits to strip the hair and flesh away. The lime ate through boots first, then skin, then whatever was underneath, and men who worked the pits long enough eventually lost fingers, then hands, to burns that never had the chance to heal between shifts. The smell of the pits followed a man home no matter how hard he scrubbed. 94. Ice harvesters cutting New England's frozen lakes into blocks by hand, 12-hour days in cold that could freeze wet clothing solid within minutes, fall through, and the same ice that made you a living closed over your head in seconds. 93. Canal navvies, the men who dug Britain's canal network with a pick, a shovel, and black powder, living in shanty camps beside the cut, buried without much ceremony, when a trench wall let go, paid by the yard dug rather than the hour worked, which meant nobody got rewarded for going slow and careful. 92. Gasworks retort stokers, raking burning coal out of ovens hot enough to warp iron, in rooms that never dropped below 130 degrees, the coal tar fumes clinging to their skin long after the shift ended. 91. Copper trammers beneath Michigan's Upper Peninsula, pushing ore carts through shafts a mile under Lake Superior, in near-total darkness, broken only by a candle stub wedged into a cap. A slipped brake meant the cart came back down without you. 91 jobs down. And notice something. Nobody on this list has died from an explosion yet. Not one. Every name so far was killed by the job itself, doing exactly what it was built to do, to a body that had no say in the matter. And we've barely started. 90. Ship's coal trimmers, shoveling a steamship's fuel from bunker to boiler in pitch-black holds that could fill with gas without a sound, in heat that never let up for the length of a crossing. 89. Hands in the small, independent gunpowder mills, working one man to a shed by design, spaced well apart from the next shed, so a blast only cost one life at a time instead of the whole crew. 88. Quarry blasting gangs in granite and limestone, where a miscounted fuse turned the countdown itself into the most dangerous part of the job, and a badly placed charge could bring the whole face down on the men who'd just lit it. 87. Cornish tin miners, breathing rock dust laced with arsenic, straight out of the ore, on top of every hazard a hard rock mine already carried, in shafts that ran out under the Atlantic itself in places, where a man could drown a mile from shore without ever seeing open water. 86. Iron ore miners on Minnesota's Mesabi Range, where a shifting wall of ore gave almost no warning before it moved, and a man could be buried standing up before he'd even registered the sound. 85. Silver miners of Nevada's Comstock Lode, working heat past 120 degrees a half-mile down, with scalding water that could flood a shaft in minutes and cook a man where he stood. 84. Placer and hard rock gold miners, from California to South Africa, buried by the same collapses that took every other hard rock trade on this list, chasing a strike that, for most of them, never came. 83. Workers in the LeBlanc soda alkali plants, standing inside chlorine and hydrochloric gas, so thick it was documented stripping paint off houses streets away, with nothing over their own faces at all, and lungs at home that gave out years before the rest of them did. 82. Makers of Shields Green, a brilliant, cheap arsenic dye pressed into wallpaper, candy wrappers, and children's toys by hand, one batch at a time, absorbed through the skin with every one of them they touched, until the poisoning caught up with the men mixing it long before it ever reached a customer's wall. 81. German aniline dye workers. In 1895, a surgeon named Ludwig Rein noticed something the dye industry hadn't, an unusual cluster of bladder cancer in the men who worked the vats. It was one of the first cancers ever traced back to a single trade, and it took years of pushback before anyone in the industry accepted it. 80 jobs down, 20 entries in, and the thread hasn't broken. Nobody here died of bad luck. They died of a substance somebody in a factory office had already decided was cheaper to keep using than to replace. 80. The sulfur mines of Sicily, where boys as young as 6, called carusi, were sold into the job by their own families to work off a debt. They'd draw sulfur ore up mine ladders on their backs, barefoot, for years before they were old enough to swing a pick themselves. Doctors of the era didn't expect a career sulfur miner to see 40. Booker T. Washington toured the mines in 1910 and wrote that he'd found something closer to hell than anything he expected to see in this life. 79. Rope walk spinners in the hemp and jute sheds, packing fine fiber dust into their lungs across a lifetime spent walking the same quarter-mile shed, twisting the same rope, hour after hour, year after year, until the coughing that started as a nuisance ended as the thing that killed them. 78. Wool sorters of Bradford, England. Imported fleece could carry anthrax spores from infected herds overseas, and the disease got its own name in the trade before doctors ever gave it one. Wool sorters' disease, spoken of the way other trades spoke of the weather. 77. The chain makers of Cradley Heath, women and children forging iron chain by hand over open coal fires in backyard forges, 10 and 12 hours at a stretch, breathing forge smoke and handling metal hot enough to take skin off on contact. For wages so low, it took a strike in 1910 just to move them at all. 76. Silk mill doffers, most of them children, hired for one reason: small hands could reach into a running frame and pull the next bobbin without anyone slowing the machine down for it. And small hands were exactly what the frame took in return when it caught one. 75. Cotton mill scavengers, children sent underneath moving machinery to sweep loose cotton, while the belts and spindles kept turning above their heads, because stopping the frame cost the mill more than the occasional child did. 74. Fire gilders, applying gold to metal with a paste of gold dissolved in mercury, then burning the mercury off with an open flame, breathing the vapor at point-blank range, one gilded object at a time, in workshops with no chimney to carry it away. 73. Floor hands in the Chicago stockyards, working unguarded blades and chain hoists among half-ton carcasses, swinging on overhead rails through rooms slick with blood, where a single slip put a man under the same chain that had just killed the animal. 72. Blast furnace top fillers, working the mouth of the furnace itself, where carbon monoxide could drop a man before he even knew the air had turned, silent and odorless, with no warning at all. 71. Iron puddlers, standing over open furnaces, stirring molten iron by hand with a long rod, in heat that cooked a man's body past what it could recover from, shift after shift, until his own heart simply gave out early. Few puddlers worked past 50 at all. 70 jobs down. And here's where this list turns a corner, because number 70 is the one that proves something uncomfortable. Doctors have known about this industry's death toll since before the United States existed. Number 70. Chimney sweep climbing boys. In 1775, a London surgeon named Percival Pott examined a cluster of scrotal cancers in grown men who had all done the same job as children, climbing bare inside chimneys, still warm from the fire, packed with soot that never fully washed off the skin, no matter how they scrubbed. It was the first occupational cancer ever documented anywhere in medical history. Parliament didn't set a minimum age for the job until 1788. They set it at 8 years old, and boys that young were still being sent up flues barely wide enough for their shoulders. 69. Hands in the nitroglycerin and dynamite works, absorbing enough nitrate through bare skin to trigger blinding headaches by lunchtime, a symptom the trade just called the dynamite headache, while standing feet from a substance that could go off from a dropped tool or a careless step. 68. Cartridge and shell-filling workers of the black powder era, rooms full of loose powder and women threading primer caps by hand, where one static spark off a shoe or a buckle ended the shift for the whole building at once. 67. Structural ironworkers on the earliest skyscrapers, walking open steel beams hundreds of feet up, with no harness, no net, and no second chance, in wind that could catch a man mid-stride. 66. Bridge riveters, catching rivets pulled red-hot from a forge in a metal cone, by hand, balanced on a beam, over a river, all day, in a din loud enough to leave a man half-deaf by 40. 65. Navvies on the Woodhead Tunnel, through the Pennines, in the 1840s, blasting 3 miles through solid rock for a single railway line, while cholera tore through the work camps between shifts, so that a man could survive the rock and still not survive the winter, in a canvas tent with 300 other navvies and no doctor for miles. 64. Drillers on the Hoosac Tunnel in Massachusetts, where engineers tested nitroglycerin before anyone fully understood how to handle it. In October of 1867, a leaking naphtha lamp caught fire inside the central shaft, and set off an explosion that killed 13 men in a single afternoon. Roughly 200 died over the tunnel's 24 years of construction in total, enough that the crews gave it a name that stuck: the Bloody Pit. 63. Laborers building dams and reservoirs, where an earthwork could fail without warning and bury a crew under water and mud faster than anyone could climb out. The whole structure they'd spent months raising, turning against them in seconds. 62. Open hearth steel furnace men, tapping molten steel at nearly 3,000 degrees, close enough that one misjudged pour could splash a man from the waist down and leave him with burns no era's medicine could properly treat. 61. Lead smelter furnacemen, breathing lead fumes straight off the ore, day after day, until the seizures and the blindness the trade called lead colic put an end to the career for good, usually while the man was still young enough to have decades left. 60 jobs down. Notice what's disappeared from this list. We've stopped talking about accidents almost entirely. From here to the finish, nearly everyone left was killed by exposure, by the job simply doing, over months and years, exactly what it was built to do to a human body. 60. Borax miners and refiners in California's Death Valley, working alkali flats in heat that could pass 130 degrees at midday, hauling refined borax out of the basin by 20-mule team because no railroad would run track into ground that hot. 59. Boilermakers, permanently deafened from hammering rivets inside a sealed steel boiler shell for a living, which was the good outcome next to the boilers that failed outright and killed everyone standing near them. 58. Ship and factory boiler firemen, feeding a pressure vessel that ranks, across the whole industrial age, among its single most common catastrophic failures. A boiler that let go didn't injure the man standing over it, it erased him and everyone near him. Arm's length away, every shift, trusting a weld they'd never inspected themselves. 57. Sheffield's dry grinders, sharpening needles and forks on stone wheels, with no water to hold the dust down. In a trade with a nickname blunt enough to double as a warning: grinders rot. Insurance men of the era noted, in their own ledgers, that few dry grinders lived to see 50. 56. File cutters, steadying blanks against a block of lead for hours on end, taking the metal into their bodies through the skin of the hands with every file they finished, one more small dose added to the last. 55. Celluloid workers in the earliest plastics mills, handling one of the most flammable materials in any factory of the age. Nitrocellulose could ignite from friction alone, and did, room after room, faster than anyone standing nearby could reach a door. 54. Rubber vulcanization workers, breathing carbon disulfide fumes thick enough to cause tremors and memory loss by the end of a shift, and in the worst cases, outright psychosis or death, in an industry that hadn't yet given the condition a name, let alone a cure. 53. Chrome tannery workers, developing chemical burns the trade called chrome holes, on hands that never fully closed between shifts, the skin simply giving up on healing at all. 52. Hands in the explosives works acid house, mixing nitric and sulfuric acid with glycerin or raw cotton, the single most failure-intolerant task inside any powder factory, done by men who knew exactly what one mistake would cost them, and everyone in the room. 51. Crews in the corning house of a gunpowder mill, the single most dangerous room in the entire works, where damp powder was pressed and dried, under conditions that turned a spark of static into a death sentence for the whole shed. 50 jobs down. Halfway. And here's the number worth carrying into the second half. The fix for grinders rot already existed too. Wet grinding, running water over the stone to hold the dust down, was known and used in some shops decades before others bothered to adopt it. The shops that skipped it had simply made a different calculation about what a life was worth. 50. Ammonia refrigeration engineers in the new mechanically cooled meatpacking plants, working alongside pressurized ammonia lines that, when a fitting failed, could fill an engine room with gas faster than any man inside could find the door. 49. Haulers moving finished powder and cartridges by horse-drawn wagon over rutted colonial and frontier roads, where every pothole was a small bet against detonation, and a broken axle could end the journey for good. 48. North Sea trawlermen, among the highest occupational death rates recorded anywhere in the industrial era, lost to storms, winch accidents, and men swept overboard, in weather no vessel that size should have sailed in, week after week, because the fleet sailed anyway, and a boat tied up in harbor earned nobody a wage, least of all the owner who'd never once set foot on deck in a gale. 47. Merchant sailors in the age of steam, boiler rooms below the waterline, rigging accidents above deck, and shipwreck that could take the entire crew down together with the ship. 46. Dock workers and stevedores, loading cargo by hand, crushed under shifting loads, or lost down open hatches in the dark of a ship's hold, where nobody above deck would hear a man go in. 45. Railroad track gang laborers, the men called Gandhi dancers, working within feet of live rail traffic with no warning system beyond a shout down the line, struck and killed by trains they never heard coming over the noise of their own hammers. 44. Telegraph and telephone linemen, climbing wooden poles by hand, and as the century turned, doing it beside wires that had gone live with enough current to kill on contact, often without any way of knowing which wire was safe to touch. 43. Streetcar and cable car gripmen, operating machinery built to seize a moving underground cable at street level, in a job where a jammed grip could pull a man straight under the car before he had time to let go. 42. Coal breaker boys of Pennsylvania's anthracite country, children as young as 8 sorting slate from coal over moving chutes for 10 hours a day, missing fingers as routine as a bruise, and falling into the machine itself when the routine failed them. 41. Laborers on the American construction of the Panama Canal. Malaria and yellow fever killed far more of this workforce than any landslide or dynamite charge. The toll on the American phase alone reached 5,609 deaths. Officially, most of them men, never touched by a single piece of machinery. 40 jobs down, 60 gone, 40 left, and every one of them from here on gets worse. This is where the list stops being a list of trades and starts being a list of specific men, specific minds, specific mornings that went wrong in ways the record still remembers by name. 40. Arsenic works roasters in Cornwall, England, calcining mine waste to pull arsenic out for the dye and pesticide trade. In fumes documented killing the vegetation for a mile downwind of the works, let alone the men standing directly over the flue. 39. The Quebec Bridge ironworkers. In 1907, a design flaw nobody caught in time brought the entire span down in under a minute, killing 75 men, 33 of them Mohawk ironworkers from Kanawake, who had become, in a single generation, the most sought-after high-steel crews on the continent, because the work paid better than almost anything else open to them. 38. Deep-shaft gold miners of the Witwatersrand in South Africa, working heat, silicosis, and sudden rock bursts a mile or more down. A rock burst could bring tons of stone off a wall in an instant, with no time for a warning shout, let alone an escape, in shafts that were, by the turn of the century, among the deepest anywhere on Earth, and getting deeper every year the gold held out, until the mines themselves were pushing past a mile down, and the rock face was hot enough to blister a bare hand. 37. Granite quarrymen of Vermont and Aberdeen. Insurance actuaries of the era had a specific term for what the job did to a man's lungs: quarryman's consumption. A career granite cutter's life expectancy was tracked, in writing, at barely past 40, a number the trade simply accepted as the cost of the work. 36. Deep shaft anthracite miners of Pennsylvania, the adult counterpart to the breaker boys already on this list, going underground instead of sorting slate above it, where black damp, a slow buildup of bad air, killed as quietly as any explosion and gave almost as little warning. 35. Crews moving finished shells and cartridges by rail through ordinary freight yards, where a derailment or a spark off a coupling could set off a load meant for the front before it ever got there. 34. Foundation gangs digging the basements of New York and Chicago's earliest skyscrapers through unstable city soil laced with old utility lines, where a collapsing wall of earth could bury a full crew before anyone on the street above knew anything had happened at all. 33. Cordite and smokeless powder mill hands, working acetone and ether solvents thick enough in the air to cause dizziness and blackouts, inside buildings that were also, by design, packed with explosive material, waiting for the same spark that had put them out cold. 32. Silver amalgamation mill workers, running the patio process from Mexico to Nevada, mixing crushed ore by hand with raw mercury to pull the silver free. That's the second trade on this list. Mercury has already killed men in, and it won't be the last. 31. Mill hands in Rochdale, England, carding asbestos fiber by hand. A rover named Nellie Kershaw took the job at 13 and spent the better part of 2 decades spinning raw asbestos into yarn before her lungs gave out in 1924, at age 33. Her own doctors linked the illness to her work. Her employer denied it to the end and paid her nothing. The autopsy that followed became the first case of asbestosis ever formally documented in medical literature. Nellie Kershaw was buried in an unmarked grave. 30 jobs down. Look what just happened at 32. Mercury, again, for the second separate trade on this list. Whether it went into a gilded candlestick or a bar of silver, the substance never cared what the finished product was. It did the same damage to the man handling it, every time. 30. Rolling mill catchers, standing at the far end of the rollers to catch red-hot iron bars with a pair of tongs the instant they shot through, in heat and speed that left no room at all for a missed grip. 29. Workers manning the lead chambers of a sulfuric acid plant, standing over vats producing the corrosive backbone of half the industrial chemistry of the age, breathing an acid mist that scarred lungs and teeth alike, year after year, until the two failed together. 28. Nitrators in the explosives trade, the chemists' assistants who fed nitric acid, sulfuric acid, and glycerin together, in the exact reaction that made nitroglycerin possible, with exactly zero margin for a mistimed batch, and no second attempt if they got it wrong. 27. Heater boys and rivet catchers on structural steel gangs. A heater boy pulled a rivet from the forge white-hot and threw it, sometimes 80 feet, to a catcher waiting with a metal cone. One dropped throw meant a burn straight to the bone for whoever stood underneath, and there was always somebody underneath. 26. Quarry derrickmen, running cable hoists that lifted multi-ton blocks of stone off the quarry floor, where a snapped cable turned every lift into a controlled fall, with nothing below to catch what came down. 25. Boiler room stokers in the textile mills, carrying the same explosion risk and furnace hazards as a ship's black gang, except stationary, feeding the same hot room for a decade or more without ever leaving it for a cooler shift somewhere else. 24. Fire-damp men in the coal mines, the crews sent ahead of the main shift with a safety lamp to test for gas. Their entire job was to be the first person into a chamber that might already be filling with something that could kill them before the flame even changed color to warn them. 23. Cupola tenders in the iron foundries, tapping molten iron from the base of a furnace stack, where a blocked tap hole could send liquid metal back out under pressure, with nowhere for the man standing in front of it to go. 22. Munitions and shell inspectors, handling live ordnance daily, for a wage, checking fuses and charges by hand on shells that had already killed the men who filled them further back down the line. 21. Box girls in the cartridge factories, packing loaded rounds by the thousand, in rooms where a single spark from a shoe on the floor had, more than once, taken the whole room with it, in the time it took to notice the smell of smoke. 20. Laborers on the earlier, French-led construction of the Panama Canal, from 1881 to 1889, before the Americans ever took over the project. Yellow fever and malaria killed workers by an estimated 22,000, historians now believe, nearly 4 times the toll of the American effort that followed it, high enough that the French company eventually collapsed under the death toll and the debt it created. 20 jobs down, 19 to go before the top 10, and from here the list stops being about trades in general. Every remaining entry has a name attached to it: a mine, a bridge, a company, a court case. This is where the record gets specific. 19. Riveting gangs on Scotland's Firth of Forth Bridge, finished in 1890. It was built with an unusually cautious safety record for its era, nets strung under the work included, and the bridge's own chief engineer logged 57 deaths at the time. A century-long research project by local historians later confirmed the true number was at least 73 men and boys, some of them never properly recorded at all. Proof that even the most careful project of its era couldn't get this kind of work down to zero, or even get an honest count of what it cost. 18. Deep coal miners, killed by roof fall specifically, as distinct from the fire-damp explosions already on this list. Far more of them died to the ceiling of their own tunnel coming down on them, one unremarkable shift at a time, in a spot they'd walked under 100 times before without incident, than ever died in a headline blast. 17. Teamsters hauling powder and dynamite for frontier railroad construction, driving crates of blasting material over unfinished roads to crews working weeks ahead of the nearest town, alone, with no way to call for help if a wheel found the wrong rock at the wrong moment. 16. The Second Quebec Bridge Collapse, 1916. They rebuilt after the first disaster, and while lifting the new center span into place, it fell into the St. Lawrence River, killing 13 more men on the same crossing that had already claimed 75, 9 years earlier. 15. Whalers, a trade already fading by the far end of this list's window, combining drowning, amputation from harpoon lines under tension, and months at sea with no medical care beyond whatever the ship happened to carry when it left port, sometimes a year or more before it saw land again. 14. Workers at the Royal Gunpowder Mills at Waltham Abbey, England, a government-run explosives works that kept recording fatal accidents well into the 20th century, proof that state ownership never made the chemistry itself any safer than a private company's. 13. Sandhogs on the tunnel projects that came after the one still ahead of us on this list. The same disease, the same bends, the same nitrogen bubbling into a man's blood, as pressure changed, just repeated on newer tunnels, as cities kept digging beneath their rivers decades later. 12. Riveters and boilermakers working combined crews in naval and merchant shipyards, taking on both trades' worst conditions at once. Sealed steel compartments, deafening hammering, and molten metalwork inside the same hull, all in the same shift. 11. Railroad brakemen in the Lincoln Pin coupling era. In the year ending June 1890 alone, records show 369 brakemen killed and 7,841 maimed from coupling cars by hand, climbing between two moving rail cars and dropping a metal pin into place by feel at the exact moment the cars slammed together. That single year, across the whole industry, 2,451 rail workers died, and nearly 23,000 more were hurt. Coupling accidents alone caused something like 38% of all railroad injuries recorded between 1877 and 1887. And here's the fix already existed thread. In its purest form, a safer automatic coupler had already been patented in 1873. It took the Safety Appliance Act, passed nearly 20 years later, to force the railroads to install it. Once they did, coupling accidents fell from roughly 11,000 a year to about 2,000 within a decade. 19 years. That's how long the fix sat on a shelf while men kept losing hands, arms, and lives, doing a job a machine could have done safely from the start. 10 jobs left. Every fix you've heard about on this list existed somewhere before the deaths did. Keep that in mind, because the top 10 doesn't get easier to hear. It gets far worse. Number 10. Fur felt hatters. Turning rabbit and beaver fur into felt, required treating it with a mercury solution to roughen the fibers, a step the trade called carroting, for the orange stain it left on a hatter's hands. Mercury vapor built up for decades in poorly ventilated hat shops, and the tremors, the slurred speech, the erratic behavior it caused in hatters were common enough that the phrase "mad as a hatter" was already circulating in England before it ever showed up in a children's book. Decades later, a physician named Alice Hamilton, the first woman ever appointed to the faculty at Harvard, hired specifically because no one else in America was studying industrial poison for a living, walked into hat factories and found men still shaking, still confused, working the trade the same way it had always been worked, mercury solution and all. Number 9. White lead factory hands, mostly women, in the rooms where lead carbonate paint pigment was dried and packed. The worst of it happened in what the trade called the stoving room, thick with fine white powder that settled on everything, including the women working it. Alice Hamilton's own surveys of American lead plants found women collapsing with seizures, diagnosed with what doctors of the era simply labeled lead colic and wrist drop, a specific, visible paralysis of the hand caused by lead's effect on the nerves. Employers routinely denied any link between the job and the illness, even as the same symptoms turned up plant after plant, worker after worker, year after year. Britain eventually barred women from the most dangerous white lead processes outright, near the turn of the century, a fix that left the pigment itself exactly as toxic as it had always been and simply decided who was allowed to stand over it. Number 8. Coal miners, the whole trade, killed both ways at once. Fire-damp explosions took men in an instant. Senkenid Colliery in Wales. Again, at 439 dead in a single blast in October 1913, the worst mining disaster in British history, and not even that pit's first serious explosion. But for every miner killed in a blast, more died slowly of black lung, coughing up the industry's dust for whatever years were left of a shortened life, unable by the end to walk from the pit gate to their own front door without stopping to catch a breath that never fully came. No other trade on this list employed as many men in as many countries for as long, which means no other trade has a body count anyone has ever fully added up. Number 7. Caisson workers, the sandhogs who built the underwater foundations of the Brooklyn Bridge. Compressed air kept the East River out of the work chambers, but coming back up too fast let nitrogen bubble straight into a man's bloodstream. Doctors nicknamed it the bends, for the way a stricken man doubled over in pain sharp enough to fold him in half. A physician named Andrew Smith documented 110 serious cases among the bridge's own workforce, 14 of them fatal, and Washington Roebling, the bridge's own chief engineer, was one of the men it crippled. He spent the rest of the project directing construction from his bedroom window with a telescope, unable to set foot on his own bridge again for the rest of the 14 years it took to finish. The first man it killed, a laborer named John Myers, collapsed at home in April of 1872, 2 days after his second shift underground. Number 6. The shell-filling workers of the First World War's munitions plants. The women the press nicknamed Canary Girls, because handling raw TNT turned their skin and hair a visible yellow-orange. That color meant toxic jaundice from the chemical itself, and some of these women died from the poisoning alone, with no explosion required at all. Some gave birth to what the newspapers of the day called canary babies, infants born with the same yellow tint, carried straight through from their mother's exposure on the factory floor. And when the plants themselves went up instead, the toll came all at once. Silvertown, in London, in 1917, killed 73. Chilwell, in Nottinghamshire, the following year, killed 134 in a single blast that leveled most of the works. Number 5. Radium dial painters, mostly teenage girls, hired to paint luminous numbers onto watch faces with a brush made from camel hair. To keep the point fine, they were taught to shape the bristles between their lips, over and over, all day, swallowing a little radium with every stroke of the brush. By 1927, more than 50 of them were dead, their jawbones dissolving from the inside in a condition doctors called radium jaw. 5 of the survivors sued the United States Radium Corporation that same year. Newspapers of the day ran a headline that didn't need any embellishment at all: "The 5 women doomed to die." They had been told, when they first took the job, that the paint was harmless enough to lick from the brush. Number 4. Cotton mule spinners, a narrow and specific slice of the textile trade, set apart from the general noise and lint that hurt every mill hand by a particular cancer of the scrotum, caused by mineral oil thrown off the machine's moving parts and soaked into a man's trousers for years on end without anyone thinking to change the oil. Between 1911 and 1938 alone, medical records counted 500 deaths from it, among cotton spinners specifically, against only 3 among the wool spinners working the very same mills a room away, because wool mules used a different oil entirely. The first diagnosed case came in 1887. It took nearly 40 years for anyone with the power to change the oil to actually change it. Number 3. White phosphorus match dippers, most of them teenage girls, dipping matchsticks by hand into an open vat of phosphorus paste, all day, breathing the fumes rising straight off it into an unventilated room. The phosphorus rotted the jawbone from the inside, a disfiguring condition the trade called phossy jaw, first diagnosed in Vienna in 1839 and documented by Charles Dickens in his own writing by 1852. Roughly half the industry's workforce were children under 13, small enough to fit easily along the benches and cheap enough to hire by the dozen. A safer alternative, red phosphorus, existed the entire time. More expensive, sitting on the shelf, while girls lost their jaws to the cheaper version year after year. In 1888, London's matchgirls walked out on strike over their working conditions. By 1891, the country's largest match manufacturer had dropped white phosphorus entirely. It took until 1910 for an outright ban to become law. Call it this list's mercury count too, minus the mercury. The same shape of story, a different poison, the same shelved fix. Number 2. Quicksilver miners at Almaden, Spain, home to the largest mercury deposit ever found on Earth. Convict labor worked its furnaces for centuries, and historians who studied the crews concluded, in plain language, that most of the men who worked the furnaces continuously did not survive the poisoning. The symptoms hadn't changed in 300 years by the time the industrial era caught up with the mine. The trembling hands, the ulcerated gums, the slow unraveling of the mind that took a man apart piece by piece. This is the 4th and worst trade on this list that mercury has killed men in. Every other use of it on this list was downstream of a mine exactly like this one. Number 1. The drillers of the Hawk's Nest Tunnel, West Virginia, 1930 and 1931. Roughly 5,000 men were hired to blast a 3-mile tunnel through a mountain almost pure silica at 25 cents an hour, 60-hour weeks. Core samples taken before anyone broke ground had already shown the rock was high-grade silica dust waiting to happen. The company drilled dry anyway. No water, no masks, because dry drilling was faster, and the contractor finished 6 months ahead of schedule and collected a bonus for it. Union Carbide's own numbers admitted to 109 dead. Congressional hearings in 1936 put the toll at 476. A later medical study counted 764. Federal researchers who revisited the disaster decades afterward estimated it was closer to 1,000. Fewer than half the men who went underground lasted even 2 months on the job. Bodies were buried in unmarked graves nearby. An undertaker paid $50 a head, and roughly 2 out of every 3 of the dead were black migrant workers who had come south looking for steady wages. This job didn't kill with an explosion, a fall, or a machine. It killed with dust, ordinary silica dust, at a speed doctors had never documented before and would rarely document again, Survivors described the white dust hanging so thick in the tunnel air that a man's lamp barely carried 10 feet in front of him, and described coughing up dust, the color of the rock itself, years after they'd left the job behind, for however many years they had left to cough at all. Less than 2 years, from groundbreaking to body count. That is the deadliest job in industrial history. 100 jobs, one thread running under every single one of them. The fix already existed, the safer coupler, the wet grindstone, the red phosphorus, the shorter shift, the better ventilation. Somebody, somewhere, had already built it before the worst of these men ever punched in for the last time. It just cost money nobody with the power to spend it wanted to spend. That's not a footnote to this list. That's the list. The dust, the mercury, the rock, the pressure. Those were just the tools. The decision got made somewhere else, by somebody who never once had to breathe the air on the factory floor. They don't build jobs like this anymore, and it has nothing to do with anyone getting safer by accident. It took enough men, and enough women, and enough children dying first to make the paperwork finally worth writing. Somewhere in the middle of that 100 is a brakeman's severed hand, a girl's dissolving jaw, a man watching his own bridge through a telescope because his legs no longer worked. None of them make it into the textbooks. All of them are the reason the safety codes in your own workplace exist at all, however far removed the wording sounds from where it started.